Hello, everyone. I am Brian Weigel, and in this lecture, we will be discussing the process of domestication and various theories for state formation in antiquity. This is a review of the section from Chris Scarry's book, The Human Past, pages 172 through 197. At the end of the Pleistocene, there were quite a lot of climatic fluctuations back and forth between glacial and interglacial periods. Following the last glacial maximum, things began to warm up after 15,000 years ago in particular, but then there was a sharp return to glacial-like conditions for at least 1,000 years during the Younger Dryas, around 12,800 years ago, or 10,800 BC. So this was a cold snap, following which the Holocene period brought in relatively stable climatic conditions that were favorable for our human species in particular. So the early Holocene, after 12,000 years ago, really saw the initial stages of shifts in human societies and subsistence strategies through ameliorating climates. We also see, as a result of this cold and warm fluctuations, the melting of the polar ice caps, which result in rising sea levels around the world. So continental shelves would be inundated through three major flooding events as a result of warm periods following cold conditions. So glacial interglacial cycles, warm average air temperatures result in increasing or decreasing polar ice caps, and that affects the height of the average sea level around the planet. So all of these things factor into some of the responses we'll be looking at in this lecture, which occur really towards the end of the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, setting the stage for climatic and environmental conditions in different parts of the world that fostered the first rise of what we might call socially complex hunter-gatherer societies, more productive food environments, allowing for hunter-gatherers to be nearly fully sedentary, living in more permanent structures, probably at least seasonally at first and later year-round, and then facilitating the interactions, symbiotic interactions between people, plants, and animals that fostered this very lengthy process of domestication. And this is what we want to focus on in this lecture. So the terminal Pleistocene sea level rise, here is a map showing mostly of the old world, the continental shelf that would have been exposed 20 to 19,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum, when the majority, when the North Polar ice caps were at one of its highest extents and sea level was at its lower extent. So this is a critical time because many of these areas would have been excellent. The darker brown areas shaded on this map would have been excellent territory for humans to thrive, yet now they're underwater as the melting of those ice caps caused the sea levels to rise and flooded low-lying areas. A process we are obviously familiar with in the modern era as well. So during the Holocene, in the last 12,000 years, hunter-gatherers adapted very well, and the ameliorating climate or the improving climatic conditions changed and favored human adaptations favored human expansion into northern latitudes and different environments, and really fostered the success of our species. So here on the top of this chart, which is a rough aridity chart from northern Europe, the Sahara Desert area, where you can see from 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was quite arid, but there was a humid phase where there was greater amounts of moisture, really beginning after 11,000 years ago and persisting for quite some time until around 2,000 years ago, when we start to see fairly rapid drying of the North Sahara into another arid phase, which it clearly is in today. So if we compare this, just as an example, with the major human periods that we've been talking about in this series, the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, Neolithic, and so on in Northern Africa, we can see that by 6,000 years ago, there's early hunting. People are out in the Sahara using those resources and animals. And then there's a slight arid phase. And then a Neolithic hunting period when also cattle become an important resource after 5,000 years ago during the cattle period. And so you have hunting, gathering, cattle herding, and then eventually horses appear and grasses are showing up. Later, as things begin to dry out, horses are diminished in use, although there still are horses there. They don't do as well in that severe arid desert as the camel does during the later metal period. So you can see how shifts in the climate, in this case, aridity versus moisture in the environment, facilitate or coincide, maybe coincidentally, with major technological changes and human adaptations. So all of this is to sort of set the stage for our discussion in this lecture about the spread of farming around the world. And in the map, you can see three slices. The first at the top from 10,000 BC or around 12,000 years ago. The one in the middle from 1500 AD or the Common Era, and at the bottom around 1960 AD. And it gives you the percentage of hunters and gatherers and the estimated number of people in the world at that time. So at 12,000 years ago, the estimate of human population in the world is only around 10 million. So what you're seeing is in the dark shaded areas, the land cover where humans are acting or employed primarily as hunter-gatherers. And you see that it diminishes remarkably by 1500 AD. Hunters and gatherers occupy fewer, a smaller percentage of the land masses and are limited mainly to the northern areas where agriculture is maybe not as productive, in Australia as well. So Arctic and more subarctic or northern temperate areas of the planet. And then by 1960, their hunting and gathering populations are limited to very sort of small regions in, say, the Amazon or in the Arctic or in very dry environments, again, where agriculture is not very amenable. But that implies that with 3 billion people on the planet in 1960, the majority of which are supported not by hunting and gathering. Today, of course, we have 8 billion or so, nearly 8 billion or 9 billion people, close to 9 billion people on the planet, which are supported through primarily agriculture and even fewer hunting and gathering societies. So that's a very general view of the changes over the last 12,000 years in human economies and subsistence strategies. Let's look at 4 important definitions that will sort of outline and serve as the framework for this lecture and the lectures going forward into the Neolithic period. The first important term is domestication, which is a biological process involving changes to plant and animal genotypes as they become fully dependent on humans. So domestication is a lengthy process of interaction between people, plants, or animals that results in a genomic change in the biology of that plant or animal in a way that it will no longer survive in nature without the actions of humans. It's beneficial to the plant because they increase the numbers in their populations, say of corn, which we'll look at in a little while, which is in far more environments today than it was 5,000 or 6,000 years ago as a native tropical grass in Central America and Mexico. Cultivation is a cultural phenomenon involving the intentional field preparation, sowing, harvesting, and storing of seeds. It could be wild seeds in particular, but it's the intentional propagation of those species. Herding is a cultural phenomenon involving the intentional changes in the relationship between humans as they keep and look after animals. Starting with wild animals and increasing that behavior and relationship. So cultivation is the plants, what herding is the animals. Agriculture is the establishment of an artificial ecosystem in which selected species of plants and animals are cultivated and reared. It requires a commitment to the relationship between humans with plants and animals. It involves major changes in the human use of earth and human social structures. It includes significant changes in food technologies, such as the invention of plows, different types of sophisticated field systems, irrigation systems, and it requires a commitment to endeavoring in food production and storage. It results in more villages with increases in populations and human social complexity. So here I've been paraphrasing from page 180 of our textbook by Chris Scari, edited by Chris Scari. Let's start with some of their first domesticates. During the Upper Paleolithic, the domestication of Canis familiaris, our human's best friend, the dog or canine, was a natural fit between wolves of Europe and Siberia and human social organizations. If you think about hunters and gatherers and humans living in small bands, much like a wolf pack would do. So wolves are social animals just like humans are. So it's an excellent natural fit between, say, a wolf puppy and a band of hunter-gatherers that are mobile hunters. The skills of the wolf, if brought into a human band of hunters, would be mutually beneficial to both. Likely the dog from the wolf is the first domesticated species. So here's a Gary Larson Far Side, where there's a pack of wolves kind of hiding behind the tree and looking in on a human settlement here. And they're saying, it's Bob, all right, but look at those vivacious eyes, that stupid grin on his face. He's been domesticated, I tell you. And there's a lot of good points in this cartoon, because through the process of domestication, plants and animals lose those natural defenses. In many cases, they may lose actual intelligence if we look at the difference between the wild auroch and the domestic cow today. There is a loss of intelligence there and a loss of defensive mechanisms. The domestic animal becomes smaller, less aggressive, more docile, and more or less robust, more or less smaller. So dog domestication occurred at least 2 times in the Paleolithic and independent of each other. Probably could be first or earliest in Europe and then in Eastern Eurasia during the Paleolithic period, but also fairly early in the Lake Baikal area of Siberia, on the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian Far East. These are places where domestication had occurred relatively early. And so looking at this chart, we see ancestral wolves in Europe and Asia, European wolves becoming Neolithic European dogs and modern dogs. And in Asia, Asian wolves become ancient Asian dogs, Neolithic dogs, and then modern Asian dogs today. And so we see that it's not a one-time event where they're all linked to a singular incident that had happened, but it was repeatedly and independently a process that happened in different parts of the world. And I would add a similar process likely occurred for domestic horse and probably domestic bovid. There were independent domestication events that resulted in a variety of modern domestic animals. Here's a very recent paper by Perry and others in 2021, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where the earliest domesticate was the wolf, domesticated into the dog, and in the Paleolithic, Canis lupus familiaris showing up at some early sites. May have occurred first in Siberia as early as 26,000 to 20,000 years ago, a little before or just during the last glacial maximum, when wolves became domestic partners of these upper Paleolithic hunters. And then dog accompanied the first Americans to cross from Siberia into North America, and they brought with them those initial hunters who came across Beringia into Alaska, brought with them very likely the domesticated dog that became dog for many Native American groups in the New World. So domestication began initially as a symbiotic relationship between humans and plants and animals. Humans provided protection and encouraged their reproduction. In another example for plants, we can look at teosinte, native grass, which becomes maize through domestication. Is a very lengthy process, and you can see here in the image the difference between the wild teosinte tropical grass and modern day corn. Let's take a step back from this process, and if we look around Southwest Asia, where many of these sort of innovative ways of living take place first, Turkey, Anatolia, and Iraq, the Levant along the eastern coastline of the Mediterranean. In Anatolia, Turkey, we see the earliest temple construction at 12,000 years old, Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old temple with an altar at the middle of it, shown in excavations here. Really remarkable, but we see the beginning use of megalithic structures and monuments for communities. This is before plant domestication is really in full swing. The initial stages had begun already, but we're seeing complex hunter-gatherers for whatever reason communally pool their labor to construct the stone temple and altar at 12,000 years ago, or in the New World around the time of the ending of Clovis and the emergence of fulsome hunters and gatherers as they transition from the very, very last woolly mammoths to hunting of bison between 13 and 12,000 years ago in North America. So basically you have the upper Paleolithic way of life in the Americas, the mammoth hunting, large game hunting coming to an end and transitioning slightly, but still highly mobile peoples living in the way that people did in Europe and in Siberia thousands of years before. And in Southwest Asia, you start to see some socially complex activities here with monumental architecture. So just a comparison of what's going on in different parts of the world make this really sort of an interesting transformation that's going on in Southwest Asia. In other parts, though, in Japan, we start to see hunters hunting and gathering, living more sedentary and more economically complicated cultures that are not engaged in agriculture, but we see the earliest ceramics, which does suggest that hunter-gatherers were fairly sedentary. The Jamal tradition in Japan goes back 16,500 years, with some of the first ceramic pottery ever created on planet Earth here. So it's a suggestion that sedentism and broad spectrum economies in more productive environments following the glacial period, or even in the late glacial period here, begin to result in transformations among hunting and gathering societies to more socially complex units. So just a quick look through the history of Jamal and ceramics. Earliest pottery development there in the world, we see incipient Jamal rope pottery of the Jamal tradition in Japan from 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. So another step in the evolution of ceramic technology among the Jamal. And then jump ahead another 5,000 years ago, the flame style pottery is becoming more elaborate, increasingly artistic, as this evolves over the millennia. So we see complex hunters and gatherers living in warmer and wetter climates that have greater biodiversity, or at least the people have figured out how to better exploit the biodiversity that is around them, to the extent that they don't have to travel further into different environments all of the time to procure enough food resources. They develop broad spectrum economies, making use of the various different environments in which they could get food, and sedentary villages emerge well before farming does. And this begins this process of domestication by these complex hunter-gatherers, the human propagation of selected species, which is an essential step toward agriculture later on. And we've already answered this question of which came first, sedentism or domestication. We know that some hunter-gatherers lived in year-round residences well before the Neolithic, and that this is a process that took generations and generations to literally cultivate and develop. For example, along the Sea of Galilee in the Levant area of modern-day Israel, Ohalo II, dated 25,000 to 20,000 years ago, so just before and during the last glacial maximum, people settled down along the shores of the lake and built permanent structures or semi-permanent structures and lived in that spot for long periods of time, having figured out how to exploit fish and birds and plants and all kinds of other resources. They didn't need to travel around as much. So at the Ohalo II site, we have excavated remnants of their huts that they lived in. We know that over 90,000 plants were consumed, and we had permanent settlements using very broad spectrum economies preceding domestication of plants and animals. But seed and grasses are showing up in smaller intervals in these huts, but just a wide variety of different plants being consumed, and that's important to note. So during different periods, we have primary centers of domestication that occur in early prehistoric domestication and eventually agriculture. You see here the approximate limits of prehistoric agriculture on this map. And by 9,000 BCE, the Fertile Crescent is becoming the earliest place where we begin to see these the stages of domestication in place, which will result eventually in the development of agricultural economies. And that's primarily the cereal grains like wheat, first off, and then later barley and rye. Also early is by by 7,000 AD, or around 9,000 years ago, the Yangtze and Yellow River basins are the home of the domestication of various plants, primarily first rice. Another early area, New Guinea highlands, where yams are being domesticated, 7,000 to 4,000 AD. Or BC, sorry, about 9,000 to 6,000 years ago in New Guinea, we see some domestication of plants. And in sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum is domesticated around 5,000 years ago. And over in the Americas, we see in central Mexico, maize is being domesticated there. And in Amazonia, we don't know as much, but certainly some plants are beginning to be domesticated in North South America 5,000 years ago, or 3,000 BC. Potatoes and other plants are being domesticated. And this spreads into the North America and the eastern United States, where some maize agriculture takes on around 4,000 years ago and forward during the woodland period. So different primary centers for early domestication of plants. And here's another look at some just common foods we have today and where they were first domesticated. So interesting to look at this, your citrus crops coming from Southeast Asia, the soybean coming from China, rice coming from India and Southeast Asia, the onion coming from India. You can see where the apple and the almond are coming from the Middle East, or Southwest Asia, we should say. Alfalfa, also rye, barley, and wheat from Southwest Asia, sorghum in Africa, lettuce is domesticated in the Mediterranean, and so on. And in the New World domesticates, sunflowers, tomatoes, beans, and corn, tobacco, potatoes, peanuts, strawberries, all domesticated in the Western Hemisphere. So all of this leading to changes in the economies, and it leaves us with some hypotheses as to, from this environment, where does the Neolithic begin, and how, why do we eventually start to see the rise of cities, city-states, and then states or collections of city-states, and eventually what we might call civilizations. A few monocausal explanations, or rather simplistic explanations, have emerged during the various periods of the 20th century investigations, and they're summarized here from your textbook, page 190 and 191. So agricultural surplus and craft specialization proposed that farming surpluses resulted in the development of full-time craft specialists, and this was proposed by V. Gordon Childe in the 1930s. The hydraulic hypothesis was proposed, I believe, by Carl Wittfogel, who argued that irrigation resulted in crop yields. And so it was really the technological invention of bringing water to fields in order for them to yield higher crops. The trade imperative, in which you have communities rich in food surpluses again, but lacking in material goods, needed to trade with people in their hinterlands to get other materials, eventually bronze, but could be beads or shells, obsidian as a raw material. And we do see some trade aspects early in Southwest Asia with Çatalhöyük and the obsidian trade and so on. Then Robert Pinheiro proposed the warfare hypothesis, where he argued that intercommunity warfare explained the formation of states along the coast of Peru. And these are what we would call monocausal explanations, meaning they're relatively simplistic, where it was one thing that spurred or sparked the rise of a state-level society. And in reality, we know today that it's far more complicated, that it is a multi-causal or multifactorial reason for why we see these social transformations in time. But this particular section, very much worth review, because it sort of sets the stage for the next series of lectures. And state formation occurred independently in different parts of the world at different periods, with the reliance on high primary productivity from intensive agriculture and the development of complex social organizations. Again, paraphrasing from Scarre, this on page 193. So we see in the Mediterranean, again, very early, in Mesopotamia, the earliest at 3500 BC, or around 5,500 years ago, in the land between two rivers, Iraq, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, we begin to see the earliest city-states beginning to develop. In northern China, about 4,000 years ago, the Indus Valley, about 4,500 years ago, ancient Egypt, around 5,000 years ago, we begin to see these rather independent, but we should also view these more as interconnected worlds, because there was influence between these communities, particularly between ancient Egypt, and Mesopotamia, where we don't have the earliest evidence preserved, or it's preserved, but hasn't been fully excavated and studied because it's beneath deep deposits of the Nile Valley, and also cities that are built up on top of that. It makes it difficult to find the 5,000 to 6,000 year old evidence of the early development of state level societies in that area. But in Mesopotamia, we do have this record. For example, the earliest writing that we know about. And it's just interesting that within a couple of thousand years, we see state-level societies emerging in different parts of the old world. And it's difficult to claim that they're unrelated to each other on some level. Now, in the Americas, things lag a little bit behind with the states of Mesoamerica and Indus, just lag behind in terms of time. And part of that is because people don't really arrive into the New World until 15,000 years ago. And so they're just not occupying that space for as long. But also the animal world in the New World is different than in the Old World. There are relatively fewer animals that were domesticated, like the bovids aren't domesticated because there's the American bison, but it's more aggressive and less gregarious than some of the varieties of bovines in the Old World. And so you don't see the larger animal domesticates in the New World that you see in the Old World. Nonetheless, had they not been interrupted through European conquest and colonization, imagine the great civilizations of Native Americans that would have resulted if left alone to develop further in time. Now, writing is another marker, or an important marker of these early states. The organizational requirements of early state societies led several to develop permanent recording systems in the form of writing. Most of these began as pictographic systems, but writing systems became increasingly stylized and focused, and were used as eventually becoming abstract, and scripts became used more extensively for even wider ranges of functions than what they were initially invented for, whether that was accounting or religious documentation or to create lists of kings and so forth. We do see the emergence and invention of writing. So in Mesopotamia, the earliest at 3100 BC or around 5100 BC, we see cuneiform. Ancient Chinese characters go back quite far, originating in the form of scapulomancy early on at 1200 BC, and I would say even earlier than that, early indications. The Indus Valley script, which is still undeciphered at 4,500 years ago. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, almost the same, almost as early as Mesopotamia, cuneiform. And any day there could be a remarkable discovery in the Nile Valley that shows that Egyptian hieroglyphs date back as early as cuneiform in Mesopotamia, but as of yet that hasn't happened. Many of these we obviously have been able to decipher. More recently, probably the Maya glyphs in Mexico and Central America really did kind of break open our study of Mayan culture and the rise of states in the New World after we were able to finally then decipher and read the ancient Mayan texts. So just to conclude, in this lecture, we discussed the late Pleistocene, early Holocene climate changes and how that warming and amelioration of the climate benefited human societies in terms of increased populations around different parts of the world. We talked about the domestication of the dog, the first domesticate in the Upper Paleolithic period, and this lengthy process of plant and animal domestication that occurred. I'll note the earliest known temple and altar in Anatolia, Turkey, known as Göbekli Tepe, very important at 12,000 years ago, that monumental architecture is occurring before agriculture is invented. We talked about the Jamal and their earliest ceramics. As early as 14,000 years ago, they're making ceramic pottery, and the formation of complex hunter-gatherer groups that are socially complicated and primarily sedentary, and times before the Neolithic and before domestication occurred. But this was brought on by advances in their broad spectrum food economies, making use of lots of different resources that surround them and rather productive environments. Noted the sedentism and great economies, broad spectrum use of the landscape at Ohalo II in the Levant along the coast of the Sea of Galilee, and then primary centers of plant and animal domestication, which then spread out from those areas across the world as secondary centers of use of these plants and animals. And then we discussed the various theories for state formation and some of the earliest state-level societies as a way to set the stage for our next lecture on the formation of the state societies in Southwest Asia. So I'll leave you here with the stele of the vultures marking the victory of Inatam, ruler of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia at about 4,450 years ago. The stela marks victory and does show in Southwest Asia the violence that went back and forth between these city-states as they competed with each other over resources and territory. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I look forward to bringing you another review in a subsequent lecture.